Thanks, Heidi, and thanks, Laura, for that introduction. We are now going to start our panel discussion, and we have a wonderful panel lined up for you. And each speaker today was tasked with not only identifying a barrier, but also proposing a solution for how to improve the evidence base for treating older adults with cancer. So again, Heidi and myself will moderate this session. You've heard from Laura Levitt from ASCO. Mary Whitehead from the Cancer and Aging Research Group will join us, as well as Dr. Hai Mus from UNC Chapel Hill, Dr. Supriya Mohile from University of Rochester Medical Center, as well as Dr. Mishu Papa-McGiver from BMS, and Dr. Meena Sedra from City of Hope. So please join us, and we will begin the panel discussion.
Great. So we have asked each of our panelists to begin the discussion by spending 5 minutes to address a specific barrier to enrolling older adults in cancer clinical trials, and then propose solutions to overcoming these barriers. And we will start with our first discussion led by Mary Whitehead.
Good afternoon. I'm Mary Whitehead, and I have no conflict of interest to introduce at this point. I'm a patient advocate and also a cancer survivor. I'm delighted to begin our panel presentations speaking from an advocate's perspective. I will cover barriers, concerns, and potential solutions, adding to format ideas for this workshop. So to enumerate some barriers, and I'm sure there will be others emphasizing some of the same, but hopefully there'll be some additional ones. Key points I'd like to bring up: trial concepts, designs, and protocols need new approaches in order to duly represent our older population with cancer. My colleagues will speak more on these issues in the next few minutes. Regulations, in many cases, must be broadened to further inclusivity, negate disparities, and just be contemporary in nature. Patients or candidates for clinical trials must not be excluded due to their rural isolation, any financial constraints, being poor, being too old, and I'd like to briefly talk about what old is in a moment, maybe no family support, and one that I've come into contact with, being told that they have taken a series of medications in the wrong order, and therefore they don't qualify, even though all of the medications, if taken in the proper order, would have qualified them. Education of the senior population is still a challenge. I think a lot of seniors think that they're guinea pigs when something like this is suggested, and they need to have the understanding that they are actually going to be participants in creating evidence. Late enrollment is less, it's very important only that there's less of a likelihood of survival the later a patient is enrolled in a study. And the rural and also there'll be less data to compile if somebody dies during the study. Access to trials needs great improvement. Location or sites for the trials to help with the rural population or people who just are never included must be improved. Transportation is a factor, or rural sites need to offer more services to draw people into their possibilities. Rarer cancers obviously need attention, but it's very difficult to enroll patients because often those patients are diagnosed at a later stage of cancer and therefore have also often a shorter time period to end of life. Reporting of trial results. The good and the bad need to be reported. We need to have a better understanding of why some of the trials don't work, as well as having more trials. We need honesty in the reporting, both in the journals and from pharma. We need to know how to adjust and change the trial designs to improve really accurate data for seniors so that it can be very valuable and useful for seniors at this time and place. I've changed the slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. You went to the concerns and I didn't check. Concerns, yeah. Are we using age as the most important factor for inclusion in clinical trials? And could I take just a moment to say, what does older, elderly, or a senior mean? And I want to just point to the fact that some are young and frail, some are old and agile. And it's very, very important to us to look at the geriatric assessments to pull in more of a portrait of those who are being enlisted in the trials. Some considerations: serious comorbidities versus chronic comorbidities. Is there a better way to represent those who might have chronic comorbidities and be safer studies for those who have serious comorbidities? What's the overall status, including more than medical records? And again, it's very important here to stress the use of the geriatric data in geriatric assessments, not just medical data. And the patient's wishes. Are they heard and are they discussed? The GA should be used more as a part of protocol and not just incidentally. They should be used more widely and in a timely fashion. I believe family histories could play a better part in assessing candidates for clinical trials. If somebody's very sick, could there be an assessment of their family and any family members who might also have had the disease? Maybe they have passed away, but in the immediate family or maybe one generation behind, could that genetic data help focus some attention on the patient at hand? Earlier compassionate use. Is there not a way to broaden options for using compassionate use in clinical trials and not just as an isolated per patient issue where one doctor might get the permission and another doctor might not? Can that be more standardized and possibly be used earlier? There needs to be full consideration, especially as we move along as a united and amazing country of many, many different ethnic backgrounds and cultures, to study the profiles and beliefs and perhaps even the religious preferences as well for people who are going to enter the trials. And disparities, clinical trials, more broadly based. They must be more inclusive, even if this is difficult for enrollment. It must be done. Solutions. Next slide, please. I'm emphasizing again the wider use of geriatric assessments. I think that geriatric assessments should start to have a Medicare code. There should be an identification of this as a valuable asset for assessing senior patients, and work should be done to start following through on having this be a standard part of coverage for patients who are seniors. When used, the geriatric assessments must be used early for good planning care and for treatment so that patients can be more involved in the decision-making and their care. Earlier collaboration with senior patient advocates would be most valuable on many levels. In addition, let's add one more rung, a senior patient advocate who's a cancer survivor, who's familiar with the world at large. And in the top of that would be a patient advocate who's a cancer survivor, who's a senior, who's done a clinical trial. Try and get those all together. Maybe there are some. We don't figure that everybody who does a clinical trial dies just the minute they finish the trial. Protocols. Review, edit, and assess with senior patient advocates prior to putting into use for the clinical trials. Emphasize the human conditions as well as data when reporting results. What difference did a particular clinical trial make in a patient's life? Not just survival. What did it do to give them a sense of wholeness or wellness or longevity? And how about doing post-trial interviews with patients in conversation with advocates, so that that could be a basis for fomenting some educational tools for the future? So we look at not only traditional statistical data, but we integrate patient personal responses to the experience as a participant. And in a final solution, will telemedicine provide a standard contact format with senior enrollees for clinical trials? My last slide, please. Next slide, please. This came to me as something that's sitting in front of us right now, critically important, no final results yet, nothing actually technically approved by the FDA, but given emergency use authorization. I think many people do not realize this has not been approved. The two vaccines are not approved. They have been given emergency use authorization. They are not licensed, they're not approved. Is this wise, considering how many millions of people will get at least 2 shots? How were the vaccines tested? How much can the public know? What populations were actually included? Did it include a lot of seniors, who it seems are going to be a lot of the people who need this vaccine? What lessons were learned? Who will do the job of fully reporting the complete and honest results of these clinical trials? How can results be applied to future clinical trials? Was it luck or brilliant planning that has brought forward the first 2 vaccines in record time? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for getting us started and kicking us off. We'll now turn the discussion over to Dr. Muss for his opening comments.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate Dr. Bertagnoli and Dr. Singh for inviting me, and all the great work of the Academy putting together the workshop. I'm going to talk a little bit about designing clinical trials for older adults, what's worked and what hasn't, as well as presenting some other ideas. So I've been in clinical trial type of research for over 40 years. And I've had the opportunity of working in the Alliance, the prior CLGB, and with the other cooperative groups. And one thing we've learned, that dedicated trials for older patients can really work. So I put 3 trials down here. And I think what's important is the first trial, 49907, was a trial. It was supported by the CTSU of the NCI. So we had participants all over the country, and it was just women 65 and old with early breast cancer. It was all chemotherapy. It was a challenge to accruing these patients, but it worked extremely successfully because it was just for older people. And I should add, as part of this trial, we asked numerous questions about quality of life and other issues related to older people: function, medication use, compliance with medication. I think an example of things that work. The other is the Medical Research Council trial in Britain, the Focus 2 trial, which was metastatic colorectal cancer, designed for older people. And it really had some dose reductions, and it accrued beautifully. It was just older people, and it had a lot of quality of life data. And also, getting back to what Mary Whitehead said, it asked patients, was it worth it? Was it worth it to be in this trial? Something very important. And then lastly, and I'll show some more data, is a recent Alliance trial actually run by one of our panelists, Dr. Sedrak, and initiated initially by Dr. Huria, looking at older people with metastatic cancer, just older patients, that not just looked at side effects, but also function. And I'll get into that a little bit more detail. We're going to talk about minimizing exclusion criteria and letting the patient and doctor decide, and especially ending those trials that exclude patients, for instance, for poor renal function, which is usually decreased in older people, and where the drug that's being tested has nothing to do with renal function. So we'll hear about that. And then Dr. Mohili is going to really talk about trials for vulnerable patients. So these are going to be people that wouldn't specifically get into a large clinical trial now because they have other comorbid illness or issues. Something desperately needed because these people are all treated in the community and in academic centers, and yet we learn nothing about them and the effects of our treatment on them because we don't collect the data systematically. What doesn't work is reminders, constant emails, texts. I'm an older generation. I don't do a lot of texts. I don't have a Twitter account. But I will tell you that we did a randomized trial in the Alliance CLGB where we randomized the entire cooperative group to constant reminders by email. And this was 15 years ago, run by Dr. Kimmick. And you got emails in days that you didn't get 100 other emails a day versus a control group. And we didn't improve accrual one bit. So I don't think that that's going to be a strategy adding to our sensory input to remind us. Next slide, please. So I think that this is a model trial of successful things we can do. This was run by the Alliance, by Dr. Sedrak, and the question was, what is the effect on function and toxicity of palbociclib, which is a new biologic drug and endocrine therapy in women 70 and older with metastatic breast cancer. So this is an older group of patients, 70 and older. And in the pivotal registration trial, and I should compliment Dr. Singh and her colleagues, they have looked at lots of registration data and follow-up data through the FDA on these patients, but there are only 37 patients over 65 in this trial. So this was a pragmatic trial. Doctors prescribed the drugs. There were no supplying by pharma, having a locked refrigerator, and all the issues with complicated clinical trials. Just prescribe the drug, do the dosing per the package insert, and collect the data. We got funding from our NCORE colleagues in the NCI, which we really thank. We convinced them to do this, and we completed accrual, which took a while, but we did it. Now, this is a trial for breast cancer in older women, metastatic breast cancer, but this trial could be extended to all the new immune therapies and everything in older patients, to put older patients. Why different? We looked at function. So we really want to know when Mary Smith takes this drug, not is she just going to have tumor shrinkage, but are we going to convert her from a community living older adult to someone who has to go to assisted living? And that data aren't collected in routine trials. We collect nausea, vomiting. We need the patient-reported outcomes, and we need the effects of these drugs on function and quality of life. Next slide, please. So I think we need to change our strategy a bit, and we need older adult relevant endpoints. And certainly we're going to collect tumor response and shrinkage and how long it took for the cancer to regrow, or did we cure the patient? But we really need to know about side effects of new drugs. Many of the new drugs, the biologics, have different spectrum of side effects, especially a lot of the immune-focused drugs now. And we really need to know about the toxicities in the older people. So collecting data on cohorts of older people, 65 and older, and really looking at toxicities, fatigue, other problems, would be really crucial. And this is especially key for a lot of the new agents where these data are not frequently available. And this is really getting into the functional change. As Mary Whitehead said, we need to incorporate the GA or relevant domains into the trials. So the GA takes time, it's expensive, but if your trial is to look at a drug that causes neuropathy, we should have functional assessments in there about how you're walking, how you're getting around, et cetera, because they're very, very important to the outcome in the older patients. And then we'll need patient-reported outcomes. We're doing much better at collecting this. The FDA has really done a terrific job in mandating it in certain trials, but we need patient-reported outcomes, not just on things like nausea and vomiting, but functional outcomes. And then we need to look at chronic toxicities. When trials are ended, and patients get out in the community 2 to 3 years later, what's been the long-term effect of curative therapies on their function and quality of life, like neuropathy and fatigue. And then lastly, I think in many trials, and it's a complicated thing, is was it worth it to that older patient to be in the trial? Certainly if they responded well, we'll get a yes. And if they didn't or had a terrible time, we'll get a no. But we really want to look at that big middle and see in general how people did. So I think these are some of the things that work and don't work and some of the endpoints. And I appreciate being able to discuss this. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Mas. So our next comments will be from Dr. Supriya Mohile.
Hi, everyone. It is really a pleasure to be here, and I'm so glad to be here with a panel of really friends talking about this issue of cancer and aging. And I feel like this is, we're kind of at the pinnacle of where we can actually enact change with many of the efforts that are happening during this pandemic, virtual conferences like this. So it is really exciting to be here. My task is really to talk about our vulnerable and frail older adults and what we can do to better enroll them onto therapeutic clinical trials. When we think about the spectrum of aging, aging is very heterogeneous. And so every older adult is an individual. And we need to personalize our approaches for clinical trial design to the spectrum of older adults that we see in real practice. When we look at the numbers, about 1/3 of patients who are older can be considered fit. These are older adults who have minimal disabilities, minimal functional problems, no cognitive impairment, and are generally should be treated as the evidence shows for younger patients, because in all the clinical trials where older adults who are fit are enrolled, they tend to do as well as younger adults. However, about 2/3 of our older adults are not fit, and these are patients who are vulnerable or frail. Vulnerability and frailty is a spectrum of clinical characteristics that put older patients at a higher risk of adverse outcomes. And those adverse outcomes include AEs, or adverse events from therapeutic interventions that we do as clinical oncologists. We gather our data from evidence from clinical trials, and we look at that evidence with the patient sitting in front of us. And we do this commonly in our geriatric oncology clinics at Wilmot Cancer Institute. Unfortunately, when we're looking at that clinical trial data, and we have a frail or vulnerable patient sitting in front of us who we know is frail or vulnerable by having done a geriatric assessment, we have trouble figuring out what the best approach is. And this is increasingly common, not just for us in our geriatric oncology clinics, but for all oncologists, especially those who work in the community for where older adults are most commonly seen. Some of the barriers for clinical trial design for this population is that there's lack of data on tolerability. The older definitions of tolerability included just what clinicians or clinician approaches use to define adverse events. However, the Friends of Cancer and work by the FDA has shown that tolerability is more broad and should be more broad. The tolerability of a product should really evaluate both symptomatic and non-symptomatic adverse events, and a complete understanding must measure how a patient is feeling and functioning while on treatment. As we heard from Dr. Mas, function is a key component of geriatrics, and it's what we want and what our patients want when they're considering their therapies. They want therapies that work, but they want therapies that do not interfere with function in a way that debilitates them. Because we have lack of data on tolerability, and we utilize phase 1 through 3 clinical trials that don't enroll older adults, once we get to phase 3, which gives us our standard of cares, the comparators are not appropriate for vulnerable and frail older adults. For example, my patients who are too frail for cytotoxic chemotherapy can't be in a trial where the comparator arm is standard of care chemotherapy. And so those patients are automatically excluded. Our study design barriers do not attend to what is known about aging, and that is because we are not working as a team. We have silos of people who work independently, pharmaceutical companies, oncologists, geriatrics, patients, and we all need to come together to really think about a trial and what is important to all stakeholders who are going to use that data, whether it's the clinician, whether it's the patient, and ultimately the patient is in charge of what happens. The infrastructure that we use, the procedures are not patient-centered. And it really means we're doing trials at academic centers where, as Mary nicely discussed, patients do not have access to, especially our older adults. And I wonder, after Dr. Levitt also brought up the IOM report from 2013, I wonder why this hasn't changed. I've been a geriatric oncologist now since 2015-ish, and I've seen things improve, but we're still struggling with this as a community. And I wonder why, and I can't help but think there's an element of ageism. Next slide, please. We learned quite a bit from our geriatric oncology trials in NCORE, NCORE being the NCI Community Oncology Research Program. In these trials, we enrolled older adults who were vulnerable and frail and excluded from clinical trials. We used geriatric assessment to determine that eligibility. And those who had 2 domains impaired on geriatric assessment were enrolled, or 1 domain impaired were enrolled. We found that we were very able to enroll patients in the time frame. Because the research question was applicable, we used a multidisciplinary team, and we used stakeholder input to help out with our trial design. In addition, we used relevant assessment and tolerability endpoints. Next slide. Our solutions are, as has been discussed before, we must work with our patients and our caregivers and families. This is a picture of Scoreboard. Mary's on there. Mary is a Scoreboard member, which is a board that works with a cancer and aging research group. And Mary has a ton of experience, and there are many patients like Mary out there who are willing to help. We also need to work with community oncologists. Through NCORE, NCI Community Oncology Research Program, we work directly with community oncologists to design trials. We need multidisciplinary input, like working with the Cancer and Aging Research Group, which is a group of investigators, patients, community oncologists who are really working together and are willing to support and give input on what assessment should be used, what trial design should be used. Many of my Cancer and Aging Research Group members are here on this panel. We need to standardize vulnerability metrics, and there's lots of options. These need to be thoughtfully considered with experts. We need better processes for developing and reviewing trials, and we need to include tolerability metrics, including function. In addition, what we learn from cancer control or what helps in supportive care needs to be integrated in therapeutic trials. If we know that geriatric assessment improves outcomes and from tolerability by guiding better decisions, we can't have a usual care arm or a comparator arm or a trial for older adults that does not include geriatric assessment. Because in my mind, it's unethical when we know that it actually helps with decisions and improves outcomes. So thank you very much for your time. And I'm looking forward to the other panelists.
Thank you. So next we'll hear from Dr. Popa-McIver.
So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I would like to say that I work in myeloma clinical development at Bristol Myers Squibb, but everything that I will be talking about today represents my own views and not those of Bristol Myers Squibb. So the barrier that I would like to discuss today is that of physical access barriers, because under the current model of clinical trials execution, all the cancer patients who are vulnerable, who don't have enough resources and who are living remotely from oncology practices are unlikely participants in clinical trials. Next slide, please. And please allow me to explain myself when I say that they are unlikely to participate in clinical trials. We know that clinical trial participation is taxing and it causes additional disruptions and demands on patients' daily lives. And the burden of clinical trial participation is amplified in patients who have fewer resources to address these demands, such as older patients. And by that, I mean, I'm referring to the differences between getting cancer care at your local oncologist and getting cancer care within a clinical trial. Because in a clinical trial, the patient has to come to the study site for multiple visits for treatment administration. for sample collection, for imaging studies. Some treatments require weekly or even several times a week trips to the study site for infusion. And even patients who are randomized in the control arm, although they may get the least frequently administered treatment, even if they may get a totally oral treatment, they still have to come to the study site at the same frequency as patients in the active arm, because the schedule of safety assessments has to be the same in both study arms. Now, for all the patients who cannot drive themselves and who do not have a formal or informal network of social support capable of assisting them with such high demands, participation in clinical trials remains unlikely despite potentially being eligible and willing to. And not all patients have caregivers able to give them rides, and not all patients live in areas with adequate, if any, formal social support services such as transportation. And I would also say, let's not forget, all the patients are on fixed income. So paying out of pocket for transportation on other related expenses, it may not be an option. Now, on top of this limited means to get to study sites, oncology practices and therefore clinical sites locations have an uneven distribution across the country, with a known aggregation in major metropolitan areas. And I have spoken about this before. And since my prior presentation in 2017, it seems that unfortunately not much has changed. For example, per ASCO's 2020 State of Cancer Care in America, 1 in 6 Americans live in rural areas, but 66% of rural counties have no oncologist. About 32 million Americans live in counties without an oncologist, while 10% of oncologists work in 3 urban counties across the country. And also in one of those surveys reported by ASCO, 4 in 10 Americans living in rural areas who had or have cancer stated that they had no oncology practice nearby. It's needless to say that this distribution of oncology practices renders trial participation even more unlikely for all the cancer patients who live in underserved areas. So if we cannot bring these patients to the trial sites due to these access barriers, how can we bring the trials to the patients? We have to solve here the old riddle of bringing the mountain to Muhammad. But luckily, we have learned a few things about running clinical trials, and we have learned how to use technology to enable us to be creative in breaking physical access barriers. Next slide, please. So let's talk about potential solutions for breaking these barriers. We could, for example, enlarge the footprint of the trials that we are conducting by expanding the inclusion of oncology community networks. So including clinical sites that are not the typical academic sites, but the typical community practices. Also, we can enlarge the trial footprint by implementing decentralized or hybrid clinical trial execution whenever possible. And also expand the support to patients and their caregivers with regards, for example, reimbursement for transportation, lodging, or meals. And going back to the decentralized clinical trial, for the audience who's not familiar with this emerging model, these are trials executed through telemedicine or mobile or local healthcare providers that are using processes and technologies that differ from the traditional clinical trial model. So these trials are conducted remotely, with the patients remaining in their home for the entire or most of the duration of the study. So it seems like this would be the ideal model to be implemented to address these access issues. However, there are still many details that remain to be clarified with regards to the optimal implementation of such models in more studies, particularly registration intent studies. And we actually had an opportunity to test out some of the elements of these decentralized clinical trials during this unfortunate pandemic. So some of these elements that have proven to work and could be used, taken forward in upcoming trials would be, for example, the use of alternative trial sites, laboratories, or imaging facilities, because as you know, typically in clinical trials, particularly those with registrational intent, we use central labs or imaging facilities for that, but alternative or local labs could be considered. Another decentralized, so to speak, clinical trial element that has been used during this pandemic and has worked out is with regards to sample collection. So instead of having the patient come to the clinic, we can ship sample collection kits to the patient and then use a courier service for sample collection and shipment. Of course, this does not apply to all types of samples, but where applicable. Another element is shipping of the oral medications directly to the patient's home without them having to come to the clinic for that. And another example that I would like to give there is data collection over the phone. And that would be pertinent for collection of information on adverse events, on concomitant medications, or on changes in study drug administration, such as dose delays, reductions, or interruptions. So I would like to conclude by saying that once we look at cancer patients holistically and understand their non-medical reasons for not participating in clinical trials, we can find innovative solutions to address them. Thank you.
Thank you. And last, we'd like to hear from Dr. Cedric, his opening comments.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I have been interested in the topic of inclusion of older adults into cancer clinical trial for a long time now. And as you can see, and as you've heard, there are many barriers. And there isn't going to be one solution that fits all. We're going to have to think about solving this or addressing this from multiple different perspectives. And today, I wanted to share with you one perspective that I have learned from some of the work that we have done and others have done. So when we talk to the physicians and we ask them, what are the reasons that prevent you or make you reluctant to enroll an older patient on clinical trial, we've heard many things, but by far the most common barrier that the provider often tells us is that they're concerned about the patient. They're concerned that the patient will be harmed by the investigational drug or therapy. Next slide. So to address that, there are many ways that are driving that concern, some of which were mentioned by Dr. Mohili, like ageism and implicit bias, or the inability to identify which older adult is frail or not frail. But one potential solution to this that we could think about when we're thinking about a concrete way is to make the trial specific to the older adults. So to think about therapeutic cancer trial in the pre and post-marketing setting, and to think about embedding aging as a focus in the life cycle of drug development. If a provider, the rationale for that idea is if doctors have specific trials for patients, they're more likely to feel comfortable putting that patient on a trial that's designed for a frail older adult or a less than fit older adult, a high-risk population. Next slide. So in here, I sort of put together an idea of what that might look like to embed aging in the life cycle of FDA-regulated products. And so on the top here, you can see that from the moment the drug is developed and there's preclinical data, it goes to a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 study. Often the approval can happen after phase 2 or phase 3, and then it goes into post-marketing surveillance. So there are sort of different types of clinical trials. And if you look at the definition of each of these phases, you will see that in every single one, the FDA defines that safety is a fundamental component of every single trial. And so if safety is a fundamental component, how could we strategize to minimize risk and improve the safety data early on in the development of the drug? Well, in the preclinical phase, we could identify ways to improve our understanding of the drug's impact on the biology of aging, the underlying aging, and that might give us a signal of how this new drug, which has been tested in animal models, might also impact things like function and cognition. In the early phases of this trial, both phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3, we could develop trials in such a way where we have a parallel cohort that's specific to older adult. There's an ongoing trial that's looking at metastatic breast cancer using an oral chemotherapy, and they are in combination with immunotherapy, and they have a separate cohort that's specific to those over the age of 70. And so then the physician can feel comfortable enrolling the patient on that trial because there's a cohort that's specific to the older adult, where they will get the right amount of monitoring needed or the right safety information collected. We could also think about an extended or expanded trial, where if we develop a trial and we find a signal in phase 1 or say phase 2, we continue to enroll additional patients after the study is, on the arm that is superior, that would provide us more data on older adults. Or as we're developing dosing, we could think about concurrent differential dosing strategies early on. So Dr. Muss referred to the Focus 2 trial and other trials that have looked at dosing interventions, but the current dosing trials are always happening on the back end. And there was a recent ASCO post by Mark Rattan and Alan Litcher, which just came out a couple of days ago, that talked about how in oncology, we often look at the maximum dose tolerated, but the maximum dose tolerated is not necessarily the minimal dose that's effective. And so I think we as regulars, as physicians, and we want to know what's the smallest dose that I could give my patient with the biggest efficacy. And finally, as others have alluded, I think there's an opportunity for post-marketing surveillance. And that could be in the concept of a registry. There is an ongoing Genentech-funded National Registry of Myocardial Infarction that has over 2 million patients, where they're followed over 1,600 hospitals, that continues to monitor the toxicities after the drug is out. And then, of course, as we've done in the Alliance, a single-arm, open-label FDA trial of an FDA-approved agent can provide the data. But this is sort of one idea to think about embedding aging throughout the life cycle so that we could give the doctors the trials that are specific to the older adult to avoid their reluctancy to put them on these studies.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. We are so excited to dig into a discussion at this point. And before we do, just want to remind our public participants, so everyone who is listening and engaging with us, that we encourage you to submit questions and comments on the public chat located below the webcast video. And we will work those into our discussion. We did want to start just by asking a few follow-up questions to our panelists, and then we'll move into a free-flowing discussion. And I'll kick it off by following up with Mary Whitehead. Just wanted you offered us so many important perspectives and comments and solutions during your talk, and I wanted to follow up on what you think strategies for education and advocacy could be that you think would be most effective to increase enrollment from your perspective.
Hi, Heidi. I've thought about it a lot, and we always talk about education and advocacy, and we want to add strategy here. I'm sorry, my phone was ringing, and it's... I'm going to shut it off, and my apologies for interruption. I thought I'd hid the phone, but it didn't work. My apologies. Anyhow, I think that one of the great networks that we need to build is the advocates who are seniors, advocates who have survived 20 years past their treatment, they're, have had a good experience and maybe have been working with clinical trials, but maybe just as advocates and as survivors, working with patients who are candidates for going on clinical trials and finding what links are missing for them, to work in educating them. We need to work on putting literature together that, if it has photographs or illustrations, actually has images of the age group that the literature is talking to, and not young people advocating things for older people. I think post-clinical trial interviews could be expanded. And I think, I don't know where that should be done or whether an advocate could have a real presence in that interview as a listener even, to digest some of what the patients have experienced, what their feelings are, what their suggestions are, saying that from the mouth of the trial people comes great wisdom in what we need to change and how we could do it. And advocates have their experience to bring to that collaboration. I think a video for education, which has a trial survivor and an advocate who's a senior, discussing the key issues that a trial enrollee would go through, would make sense. Again, it could be, I don't know if it's been done. Hi, maybe can fill me in if this has in fact been done 100 times and I'm bringing coals to Newcastle. If so, I apologize. But I think linking the trial participants and advocates to work on ideas for communications is one of the ideas that really comes to mind, and that it must be patient-centered.
Thanks, Mary, and it's great that you roped Dr. Muss into this. And I wanted to, kind of pick up on this idea of, and Mary, you talked about more following up post-trial and, the kind of, was it worth it? And, but Heidi, you talked a lot about trials that were targeted specifically for older adults. But what if you have, for example, a drug that's kind of for all comers, or, in a common tumor type like lung or breast, and the company is trying to get to approval, and despite their best efforts, they were not able to enroll an adequate representative representation in the pivotal clinical trial. Do you think, or what do you think the role could be in terms of, drug lifestyle, in terms of looking at that drug in a post-market setting?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I want to reassure Mary too that we have, at least in the Alliance, patient advocates all through our committees, and I'm sure all the other cooperative groups do. So we're listening now. In other areas she mentioned, I think they're great ideas, but we're trying to do that and get the voice of the patient right at the meeting and when the protocol is done. As far as your question, Harpreet, I think that term post-marketing means a lot. I know today, we all as doctors are supposed to, if we get an unusual event, post-marketing, put it in, but I don't know if that's a highly successful system. So when I think of post-marketing, I think more of what Dr. Sedrak said and Dr. Mohil. I think you really need to define these older group of patients and specifically collect data on them. It could be done in a registry trial. I don't think the mechanism is important, but it has to be a specific group of older patients, and you have to get the data you need, like functional data. I think getting back to your other question is, when clinical trials are done today in cancer, the ages of the patients are woefully below that of the general population with this disease, especially chemotherapy trials. And I think to mandate that a certain amount of older people would be in the trials would be very difficult and might actually slow down the accrual for all the reasons and barriers here. So my view would be that if you have a randomized large registration trial and there's a winner, that you might then keep that trial open for a cohort of older patients to collect just the data we want, the toxicity and functional data. So you could expand on the numbers you have. You have a certain amount of older people, it might be 5%. And I noticed one of the comments by Dr. Shilsky concerning this. So you might need another 50 older patients to get confidence intervals on some of the other toxicities, peripheral neuropathy, bad fatigue. And I think that that could be built into the trial. And perhaps that cohort, you could get some geriatric assessment data like falls and other fatigue and social support and all the other things we've talked about. So I think that that is a possibility. And that would mean amending the trial. I think there are many mechanisms to do it. But I think the routine way we collect post-marketing data today, and you're the expert, not me, just isn't going to get to the granularity of the information we need.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Moss. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on in the chat that we're going to keep referencing as well, some of which was just addressed, which we appreciate. But I want to get back to this topic of enrolling not just an increased number of older adults by chronologic age, but representative older adults. And so this is a question directed at Dr. Mohile. Specifically as we think about, patients with multiple chronic conditions, as you pointed out, vulnerabilities or frailty, even if we increase the chronologic age on trials, we may not be enrolling those patients. And you gave us a statistic that was rather startling with respect to the proportion of people in the older age group who have these vulnerabilities. So from your experience, what strategies would you recommend to help identify and enroll vulnerable adults on treatment trials to give us that efficacy and safety data?
Thank you. I'll go back to the chat because I think what is happening in the chat here is very interesting. And what we're conversing about is, what is our target proportion of older adults on our trials? And I really think that we can't reach, if we have this clinical trial structure that's building on one step leads to another, and we learn dosing from phase 1, and then we learn about toxicity from phase 2, then we go to phase 3, and we're comparing we're comparing a new therapeutic regimen to a comparator group where that comparator group was tested the same way. And in the real world, we're doing primary dose reductions for older, more frail adults because we don't have data. So we want to give treatment, but we just sort of make it up and we do what we can. Or we are trying to use, newer therapies with better side effect profiles with limited data because it just wasn't tested in older, more frail adults. So I really think it's the research question. And the research questions are different for vulnerable and frail older adults. And yes, we're going to do a better job at fit older adults by doing some of these, what Dr. Musk described as expansions and parallel. But for your older, your vulnerable, more frail adults, there is a value to studying that population, if just for marketing purposes. And looking at lower doses, looking at different clinical scenarios. When I'm a GU oncologist taking care of bladder cancer patients, and when immunotherapy came out for bladder cancer, it was for patients who previously received chemotherapy. That's how it was FDA approved originally. And at that time, immunotherapy had a better side effect profile, and I wanted to give it to my patients before they even had chemotherapy. So why can't we recognize those clinical scenarios that may be worth it for for industry, for patients, for all of our stakeholders, and really study that for vulnerable and frail older adults. So that requires different designs, different funding mechanisms, but actual trials for vulnerable and older adults. And that's what we've learned from our work. The research question is super important for this population. And I will say, from working in NCORE, which is a network of community oncologists, our patients, older adults, are being treated at all frailty levels. So it's not like we can restrict or not restrict. When the drug is out, they will be treated. It's just done in a non-standard way because we don't have the data.
Thank you. So I think we'll pivot real quickly. There was a comment in the chat about, thanking, our panelists for highlighting the issues around transportation, sort of bringing up this issue again of geographic access. So a question for Dr. Papa-McIver: what could incentivize sponsors to expand geographical access and employ decentralized trial design strategies to enhance enrollment for older adults? I mean, it's so critical for our patients.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And the benefits of decentralized clinical trials are many. To name a few: patient centricity, enhanced recruitment and retention, increased access to more diverse patient populations, and reduced time, burden, and cost of managing patients to the clinical trial site. And this model of clinical trial execution has already been implemented in some trials in oncology. However, there are still some challenges that are still being worked out with regards to wider implementation. And I would like, for example, to mention a few but important ones, like the need to qualify both the technologies to support such studies and the technology providers to ensure data quality and compliance. And needless to say, these technologies must be easy to use and suitable to the sensory impairments frequent in all the patients. The need to adapt internal quality management systems such as policies, standard operating procedures, and trainings, ensuring the quality of incoming data using these technologies, ensuring the chain of custody of the investigational product if the drug is shipped to the patient's home. And also there are some legal challenges involved in here, like with regards to differences in between states in telemedicine licensing laws that may preclude some site-to-patient interaction. However, in my opinion, the foremost important challenge comes from the lack of regulatory guidelines, because clear regulatory guidance on decentralized clinical trial implementation in clinical trials, particularly trials with registration intent, is critical. And the support of the FDA for modernizing clinical trials is well known and highly welcome. And we know that the agency has worked closely with stakeholders to evaluate the role of decentralized clinical trials and mobile technologies. And as an outcome of that, in 2018, the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative has published a set of helpful recommendations that do provide a nice framework for addressing key challenges. However, in my opinion, specific regulatory guidelines issued by the agency would be the needed incentive and would provide the needed roadmap for wider implementation of decentralized clinical trials.
So thanks. I mean, I do think, and I want to say that the FDA for many, many years has been talking to companies about decentralized trials, or really, I think, hybridized trials, because there are some concerns certainly with rolling out a new drug and having patients, completely virtual. But it's COVID that pushed it. And we did actually release the guidance, as you know, in March, and we've updated it several times on COVID. How to basically conduct your trial to keep patients safe in the COVID era, which basically is running a decentralized trial. And I do think, although I can't guarantee you, but I think it's highly likely that many of those, first of all, we didn't change any regulations. We didn't change any rules. We just, as you pointed out, I think industry is by nature risk averse. and never took us up on our offers that we said, why don't you do some of this remote? And now they have finally been forced to do it. And we're in a learning process right now. And we could talk about decentralized trials for days, but I think that I really hope that there is some silver lining to this pandemic that we're in that will kind of shift some of these adaptations we've had to make the clinical trials to more permanent. I want to turn it back to Dr. Sedrak, and I find your research just so intriguing about physician bias. And I think it's real. I think it's out there. I think I may have had a little bit of it, maybe still do. You know, is that what do you think can be done to kind of address these physicians who may have geriatric training, likely not, because we know there's going to be a dearth of experts. Already is, but will be. What can we do to address this barrier of physician bias?
I think physician bias is a complex barrier, like you said, and there's a lot of reasons for potential bias. Some of that is implicit bias. You know, we in the geriatric oncology world, we know that there's a difference between chronological age and functional age. We are acutely aware of how important it is not to just rely on our eyeball test to say this patient is 80 years old. I don't think she's going to be eligible for a phase 1 study. But the majority of physicians are not. That is the current approach. One way to combat that is to think about how to alter the eligibility criteria for studies so that physicians can think about patients in the way that we want them to think about patients. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. If you look at the majority of all therapeutic cancer clinical trials, they use performance status as a key criteria. And we know that performance status is a suboptimal measure of people's function. And it has a lot of implicit bias in it because it's a clinician-based tool. So could we think about a hierarchy of comorbid conditions that could be used to evaluate patients who may be suitable for the study? Could we think about ways that we could embed functional age, like screening geriatric assessment measures that could be used as a way to think about who might be a good fit for that study, so that we could balance the goal of the study, which is to test a new investigational, potentially harmful drug in as many people as possible.
Great. Thank you so much. And, I just wanted to follow, there's a lot going on in the chat right now, which is really exciting. And, just maybe two things, Mina, to follow up on your comments, and Hai or anybody else could jump in as well. One comment was, and this leads to the work that you've done and many others that shows that there is no one solution, right? But certainly decentralized trial design seems like a really big and important one to access, to improve access to our patients. But, do you think that this is, that's going to be the silver lining in and of itself? It sounds like your answer to that would be no, but your comments around that and maybe a little bit more from your perspective around whether or not there are studies that have looked at interventions for caregivers, for example. So, the study's open and the patients technically have geographic access, but they're still not enrolling. Some of the other aspects, we've talked about a number of them here.
Yeah, we actually, we have an ongoing study right now where we have a qualitative interview with patients and their caregivers to try to understand their perspective of the barrier. And one of the issues that we are hearing, the study is not complete yet, is that the studies are demanding. They require many procedures. You need to have a pre-study biopsy. You need to have a post-study biopsy. And then like a year later, you have to have another biopsy. And so though there are challenges in how we can, when we talk about decentralizing, I think it's a great idea, but it also means that we have to think about what that means in terms of the type of procedures that we will have to change to be able to do. You could get a blood draw drawn at home now, but you can't get a biopsy done at home.
Yeah, and I really think we have to kind of think about, as a community, what kinds of trials and what kind of data are we talking about? So are we talking about trials that lead to the approval of a new drug? Because I think that we all agree that I think that the amount of labs and research studies and correlative studies and biopsies, we don't know if they're going to yield us anything or not. But, you know, part of running clinical trials is science. So could you have like an arm, I think like Hai pointed out, is in our FDA guidance of a parallel arm. You know, I think this is somewhat of a compromise to to just waiting until the drug is out there on the market and you're using it in clinic, but to know that there's another arm that's ongoing. Now, one criticism or one thing we've heard from industry on that is if you have a randomized trial and it's blinded, and then you have this parallel arm with the treatment, so the intervention, and you have the same investigators, that they would be automatically unblinded, basically, because they would understand the toxicities since they have this open label arm. And so I think that's something that, you know, would have to be considered, although you could think about, when we think also about decentralizing, I think we also need to think about who we're asking to be our investigators. And if it's a disease like lung cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, diffuse large cell lymphoma, multiple myeloma, I could go on and on. Should you be required to have a few investigators that do have geriatric expertise? One study that I saw around caregivers is also around kind of nurse navigators, nurse practitioners, geriatric physician's assistants. Have any of you had these experiences in clinic as part of your healthcare model? And what, Supriya, I see you shaking your head. What can you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I wish. It would be great to have nurse navigators that are focused in geriatric oncology. I think there have been some studies. I don't know that it was in the context of improving, you know, caregiver perceptions or helping specifically with geriatric oncology patient enrollment. But I think it could be very helpful to do this. The question is how to fund these kinds of people in a cancer center. It's very difficult. And then especially when you're thinking about the community where most of our older adults are being seen, you know, you'd have to look at an embedded model where you're training someone in the practice to be the person that would be doing this, maybe the social worker in a practice or a nurse practitioner in the practice. We just got funding to do another large study in NCORE looking at geriatric assessment interventions, but training the advanced practice providers rather than the clinicians. So I do think advanced practice clinicians are going to be really a key in the care of older adults moving forward, and perhaps could be helpful in trials too.
Terrific. Well, we're getting towards the end of the session, and we've heard a lot of potential solutions and next steps raised. And I wanted to kind of circle back to you, Laura. You opened the session and talked about many of the activities that ASCO has undertaken. Today, we've heard about some solutions directed towards other stakeholders, FDA sponsors. So, not to put you too much on the spot, but sort of your thoughts about actions that ASCO can take to continue contributing to progress based on some of what we've heard today.
Yeah, thank you, Heidi. I definitely think ASCO is doing work in a lot of the areas and themes that were raised today. I know Rich Hilsky is talking later in this workshop about the policy solutions, and will reiterate ASCO's positions on potentially the need to expand FDA's authority to require or incentivize research on older adults in registration trials. But I also think we're doing quite a bit of other work that relates to things brought up in this session. So our Road to Recovery report that was released in December lays out what ASCO thinks clinical trials should look like as we move away from the pandemic and return to a new normal. And that calls for a lot of the elements of decentralized trials, so maintaining telehealth, remote assessments. So a lot of the things we've talked about today. I also did want to mention that ASCO and FDA are co-sponsoring a workshop on oral adherence later, February 2nd and 3rd. And I think the issue of dose optimization will come up quite a bit during that discussion. And there's actually a special session on older adults that also gets on the unique barriers and challenges and solutions for older adults taking oral medications. And then I think ASCO has done quite a bit of work around geriatric assessments. Its guideline recommends their use. We've done a survey looking at the obstacles to clinicians implementing geriatric assessments in practice, and we're starting to think about whether ASCO needs to develop some tools or resources or do other things to actually increase their implementation in clinical practice. So I think all the things that came up today, ASCO has a role in furthering. So we'll just need to keep partnering with all the stakeholders and people who are involved in today's workshop.
Thanks, Laura. And ASCO's been a great partner to us, and we hope to continue this momentum. So with that, we'd like to wrap up our first session. Thanks, Heidi, for moderating. Thanks to all the panelists. I hope for the audience, this really gave you a preview of some of the sessions, some of the topics that we'll be taking a deeper dive into in our future sessions. And I hope you'll stick around for the rest of the conference. I'll turn it back over to Monica.
Okay, thank you very much, Harpreet. Oh my goodness, what a tremendous first session, and just to see the activity and exchange already in the chat room has basically said to me that this is just going to be the start of some really in-depth discussion and thinking as we go forward. So one of the things that I think came out pretty loud and clear from this first session, in addition to how challenging this is the fact that studies that are specifically designed and focused and take into account the needs of our older patients are what is in order here. And so for the session this afternoon, and then ones we will have on Monday and next Wednesday, we're really going to talk about those success stories. So those of you who've been kind of a little bit discouraged by this description of how hard it all is, please come back, because then you're going to hear from some outstanding researchers who are actually meeting all of these challenges and can show some best practices for producing the results. Okay, we're going to take a 15-minute break, come back at about 2:50 for when we can start our next session. So see you all in a little bit. Thanks.